I think at this point I can safely say that 3D platformers are probably my favorite genre out there. There is something so fundamentally satisfying about walking around, exploring all kinds of worlds, interacting with objects, and making my way through a carefully designed level while getting more and more comfortable with the moveset at my disposal. From Neon White's high-paced action, to the more combat-focused experience of Blue Fire, to the creativity on display in A Hat in Time. And that is just accounting for the ones not created by juggernauts like Nintendo themselves or even Rareware back in the day. Clive N Wrench truly wishes to be among those reclaiming the 3D platformers from the late 90s and early 2000s. But the experience leaves a lot to be desired from both the fundamental level as well as this particular version on the Nintendo Switch. Clive N Wrench sees you controlling the titular characters on a quest through time and space to stop the evil Dr. Dracus, who has been traveling throughout time to spread his evil elixir and gain world domination. Thankfully, Clive's sister Nancy has created a time machine which enables you to travel to the past, collect pocket watches to fix the space-time continuum, and stop the evildoers that have aligned with the Doctor. The game began development over 10 years ago by a single developer, Rob Wass. The game is pretty packed with content. There's an abundance of worlds to explore, with each one designed after a different time period or theme. On the surface, it truly feels like one of the 3D platformers from the golden age at the tail end on the 90s and 2000s when character platformers were everywhere. The thing about character-based platformers is that they usually rely on their characters to a certain extent to keep the player engaged. Yes, franchises like Mario and Sonic had a bit of an advantage making their jump to 3D after their characters were long established, but especially for the wave of 3D platformers that came after them, character was everything. I don't think that series like Crash Bandicoot, Banjo-Kazooie, Conker and Rayman would have been as successful if not for their unique design and personality. Clive N Wrench really feels as thin as paper in this sense. While the world building and designs are fine, during gameplay there is very little to make you feel attached to Clive, Wrench, Nancy, and any of the other supporting characters that show up. The one exception might be the bosses, who each get a dedicated cutscene before you engage with them, but even then there is a real lack of explanation of why they are involved like this. The entire setup of the world and the reasons for events happening feels like an afterthought. And what does not help is that the cutscenes in particular are rather horrendous to look at. Lots of exaggerated movements that are designed to come across as cartoony feel still and slow and lack the dynamic range that conveys a connection to the player. That is not even speaking of the writing and text boxes which simply pop in and dump the same text every time you engage with them. I was especially annoyed when I returned to the main hub world after clearing 4 worlds, and Nancy would still say that I should go to the orientation level to learn how to control Clive N Wrench. It made me lose interest in the world and characters very quickly. Of course, mentioning the story for a 3D platformer isn't doing the game justice, because what really matters at the end of the day is how these characters control and feel while playing them. In terms of pure control, I think that the best point of comparison would be a game like A Hat in Time, but feeling a tad more floaty and a bit more imprecise in its execution. Aside from the standard jump, double jump, spin attack, ground pound and helicopter whirl, using Wrench as a literal helicopter, there is very little that sets apart the moveset of the main characters. There is a super jump that can be executed as either a backflip or by holding the R button, and it feels slightly too overpowered, but can be combined with the double jump and the helicopter whirl to traverse long distances. The real issue is in how controlling the characters feels. Oftentimes, the game comes across as too sluggish, where you really can't gauge well if you'll actually make a particular jump and at what point you should try to find a safe landing spot. There is the implication that you can combine a sort of slide jump to gain speed, but it never felt particularly satisfying. And that is before you even consider the level design, which mostly feels restrictive due to the levels being broken up into several segments. While I like the theming and attention to detail in these worlds, there are some weird structural decisions that hamper the experiences. In each level, you go around and find upwards of 10 ancient stones, the Power Stars equivalent of this game. Most of them are achieved by helping characters with particular quests or finding them scattered around the level. The real issue is that there really isn't that much variety in gaining them. Catch the running rabbit, you get a stone. Do a ground pound on a particular button, obtain a stone. Destroy X amount of objects, you get a stone. Of course, games like Super Mario Sunshine have similar structures in their missions, but because of the way levels are set up in Clive N Wrench, the repetitiveness of the game really gets in the way of making these quests enjoyable. It also means interacting with characters, and as stated before, that gets quite tedious. I think what really could have helped here was if levels weren't restricted you to finding a set amount of ancient stones to allow you to beat a boss, and only after beating them you unlock the next world. This game is very linear in that structure, and while it isn't a problem on its face, it does mean that you will need to both explore each world, at least until you found enough stones, and beat the bosses of each world, which are locked behind a specific stone requirement. Also, the bosses just suck. Like, the bosses are some of the most disappointing I've faced in a game. They can't be tackled out of order, and the first one you'll encounter is incredibly difficult. It feels much like a Crash Bandicoot boss where you need to position yourself around the stage to make him throw scissors at ropes that make an anvil come down on its head. The problem is that unlike a boss in a Mario game or Crash Bandicoot, you aren't locked to a 2D plane, but you are still dealing with movement in 3D. This means that you can still jump off the platform without meaning to, while projectiles are shooting all around you. There are also no health pickups in this boss fight, so you will inevitably lose, and the boss fight immediately resets, giving the player far too little time to respond to the game over and getting stuck in a very frustrating loop. The other bosses don't fare too well either, with each having their own gimmick, but doing very little to justify the hardship you'll have to deal with as a player. They are just incredibly sudden difficulty spikes, and while I am a seasoned player of 3D platformers, I cannot fathom younger players enjoying these boss fights and not having a way to get past them to experience the other levels. I should clarify that I don't think that Clive N Wrench is unplayable. The game is fine, but on Switch it looks really, and I mean really bad. At times you could be mistaken that you're watching an actual GameCube game because of the stiff animation, the terrible draw distances in particular in the larger stages, and the way models and lighting interact with one another. When I saw the first footage of the game in action a few years back, I was incredibly impressed with the way it was turning out. But the Switch version is really a downgrade in almost every possible sense. The one thing I'll say for it is that the game runs at a stable frame rate, ignoring pop-in, animation, the lack of shadows, proper lighting, and the very bad looking character models. That is something going for it. It really looks like the developers compromised on graphical fidelity in order to get the game running at a stable frame rate, but at that point you're really just shooting yourself in the foot. Really, if you crave portability, the game is functional, and it may be fun for a few pick up and play sessions, but I think that this version in particular doesn't do any justice to the design and intent of Clive N Wrench. And I think that is what stings the most here, because even while I felt mostly nothing while playing Clive N Wrench, I did get a sense that it was truly a passion project from a single creator. This game is just the biggest swing, and it's a shame that it is mostly a miss. You can sense that there was so much care and design put into the game and its worlds, but it almost feels like it's crackling under its own weight from the very beginning, as if levels that were designed 10 years ago are still part of this game, even though they fully exemplify why Clive N Wrench just is not a lot of fun to play. Worlds are either too big or too cramped, characters are stuck in the same eternal loop while engaging with them, and show no growth. There is no way to expand your moveset and actions or any power-ups to change up the gameplay. There's a neat way to detect if you're missing pocket watches, but there's no reward in a level for finding them all, making them feel quite pointless unless you're a true completionist. Clive N Wrench attempts to revive the 3D platformer, but ultimately shows how the trappings of the genre made it die out in the first place. All around while exploring levels, it feels like there's a lack of focus, a wish to perform like a jack of all trades, but ultimately barely mastering the fundamentals of a proper movement in the 3D space. I do not think that this game is entirely bad or a complete mess, but it is the missed potential that stings. Especially with the graphical compromises on Switch, this just does not look good. It is a plea to sometimes take a step back and fundamentally understand what your work should be about. Sure, there is enjoyment to be had, but much like a fast food meal, I will not be thinking about Clive N Wrench much in the future.